各位贵宾，谢谢您亲自的参与。今天我们非常开心能够邀请到Professor Pasquale 为我们进行演讲。他今天的讲题是黑箱社会无所不在的数据演算法对公民社会的挑战。我是科技部人文社会科学中心博士后研究员陈柏良。那我们今天也非常荣幸的邀请到洪文玲教授能为我们进行主持。洪教授目前是台湾科技与社会研究学会的会长。Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your coming. Today we are very honored to invite Professor Pasquale to have the public speech here. His topic is After Black Box Society. After Black Box Society, in the shadow of the social credit system. And today we are also very honored to invite Professor Hong to be our host. And Professor Hong right now is serving as the president of the Taiwan Science, Technology and Society Association. So, 那在演讲开始前，我们请各位来宾为我们的讲者给予最热烈的掌声。Professor Hong, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was so nice to see all of you here. It is my honor to introduce to you Professor Frank Pasquale. And he is a professor of law affiliated with Carey School of Law, University of Maryland. And he is an expert on the law of artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. Professor Pasquale frequently presented on the very important issues of the ethical, legal, and social implications of the information technology for various sectors, participants, attorneys, physicians, and government officials. Professor Pasquale has advised various sectors, including U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Energy and Commerce committees, and also as well as officials in Canada, United Kingdom, and EU. And he is the author of this best-selling book, published in 2015 by Harvard University Press, The Black Box Society, the secret algorithm that control money and information. This very book that I'm holding out was printed in 2016, and it's already the third printing. Yeah. So, and this book has also received an East Bay Express Best Nonfiction Book of the Year and a FlavorWire Best Book of the Year by an academic publisher. So, dear audience, as digital technology researchers, regulators, developers, users, as well as citizens, please, let's jointly welcome Professor Pasquale.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. And also, just many thanks to the STS group here, to NTU, to Jeannie, Lou, Professor Lou, and myself, Professor Chu, for just incredible, fantastic hosts. And not only inviting me to speak here, but also teaching me so much about, I think, very distinctive and important lessons of the Taiwanese legal tradition, which I try to bring back to the U.S. Each time I return or visit here, which is always great. Thank you. So today's talk is going to focus on the aftermath, or what happened after the publication of the book, in terms of thinking about what has changed in our digital society since very early 2015 when the first edition was published. And to do that, I should start with what was the main argument, right? So the main argument was something, a metaphor inspired by engineering. And it's the metaphor of a black box, that input can go into a system, output comes out, but we don't know exactly how that transformation happened. So that's a bit worried. Just to preview the end of my talk, I'm a bit worried that in the developments of the past 3 years, we used to worry about having a black box society, but I think we may have a black hole society in terms of some of the troubling trends that we're seeing in contemporary social life. To put a bit more of a picture of what's happening here, you can see that our personal data has been harvested all the time. On cell phones, via credit cards, via surveillance cameras. What's kind of remarkable too is the centripetal combination of all of these things perhaps into the cell phone itself, right? If you use cell phone as a payment system or something, via Alipay or other types of systems. And the black box described in the book is the very sophisticated algorithms used by companies like Google, Facebook, Tencent, WeChat, others. And what those algorithms are doing is that they're systematically analyzing how good we are at various tasks or in various capacities. So for example, you can have search results were probably our first exposure to these algorithms. And they're quite miraculous, right? Oh, sorry. Oh. Excellent. All right. Great inventiveness. Yeah. Very, very good. Oh, well, that's great. And I think it is funny because I think that what a lot of these systems do is they have an influence where they try to sort of fit everyone into a mold. But as you can see from my extreme height, not everyone fits in a mold. So we have to avoid the Procrustean impact of these systems. Thinking about all of these different results, they also result in things like a threat score or a risk score. So there's a lot of worry there. So for example, the government may want to figure out who is a terrorist or who is not. And when I wrote the book, I was looking particularly at United States technology in the wake of 9/11. But what's also fascinating is to see how fast this technology is spread around the world. For example, in Europe, IBM has promised to the European government the ability to assess each refugee, to assess whether the refugee is a terrorist threat or not. In China, I think in the Xinjiang province, Xinjiang, sort of a Muslim majority province, I believe, this type of system is extremely pervasive. And sometimes people can get a call, if they leave the province and the police ask why you left. Well, they've been assessed in a certain way as a potential risk. There's also the social credit system that I'll get into a bit later that is part of the Chinese outline for a social credit system 2014 to 2020. We're now almost to the culmination of that system in 2020. And that system is quite important, the black box system. There's blacklists that in China would keep you from traveling. I think there are 2 billion people now who are on a no travel list. They also can't stay in hotels. But it's not necessarily algorithmic. That can just be a blacklist in general from surveillance. And there's employability investment, test scoring in schools. Many different aspects of this can be the output of the black box, right? There are many different ways in which each of these systems can assess a person's value. And one of the big arguments of the black box society was that these systems were treating people like things, that they were applying scientific methods to individuals that would be totally uncontroversial when it came to arranging materials, but that we should be more careful when we categorize and classify human beings. And this is ultimately a theme of the book, is the tension between natural science methods, which sort of see the world and try to manipulate it, and the rule of law, which I think can be quite often, it's very important for the rule of law to allow people appeals, due process, other ability to assert themselves and to assert that perhaps, say, the data in these systems is not accurate or irrelevant to the determination at stake. Another just sort of theoretical aspect of the book itself, was this idea that there are spheres of algorithmic authority. So what I tried to do in the book was to look at the main uses of data and algorithms to classify people, and I tried to divide it into a three-part scheme. The first being reputational entities, those that rank and rate individuals. And you can think of that as just different scoring systems that an employer might use, teachers might use, others might use to rank and rate individuals. But we often need to find those systems, and the way we find them is often through search engines, right? Or various forms of looking for, WeChat is a great example of having a very complex array of services on offer. You can find a doctor, you can find your local post office, you can pay bills, etc. You go through those sort of search functions on these large internet platforms. But what determines which internet platforms succeed is often finance, right? And that sort of is the most complicated part of this book. I'm not going to get into it today because the finance stuff is very context specific, very specific to particular countries. I'm going to try to address things that I think have a more global valence. But finance entities are entities that rank and rate the entities that rank and rate the entities that rank and rate individuals. So I try to do this model, and I realize it doesn't always work. There are ways in which the search and finance entities combine, the reputation and search entities combine, etc. But I think it's a useful way to think about where power is held. And one of the big efforts of this book was to try to say that our old divides of subject matter, say politics and economics, that they were becoming outdated because the political and the economic are so interconnected. And that replacing political science and economics, we could, if not replace them, at least supplement them with studies of reputation and search and finance. That was sort of one of the social theory part of the book. And it's funny because I think a lot of people who read the book just thought of it as more of a legal reform intervention. And it was that. But as what we'll also see tonight is that I feel that many of the legal reforms, even in 2015, are somewhat outdated right now. And I had a sense even then that they were outdated. And that's one of the reasons why I also tried to make it both a legal text and a social theory text. Because you don't want to spend 5 years writing a book and then find that it's outdated a few years later. I think the social theory lasts, right? But I'll go through somehow I've changed in my mind on some of the legal aspects. The reason the book resonated, I think, is because it talked about what I call the unfair deal of the digital age. And the unfair deal is that very often ordinary persons are scrutinized more and more. We see surveillance cameras everywhere. Everything we do on our phones is captured somewhere. If you look right now, citizens in Europe are asking Google and Facebook for all the data they have on them. Right? They can just put a subject data matter request and request everything. And they get back literally thousands of pages of, say, on Google Map, every place they've ever visited. From on their email, all emails sent. We probably knew that was out there, but may not know that even the deleted ones are still on their servers. You delete them, you don't have access to them, but the firm may have access to them, right? That's a fascinating asymmetry. Someone downloaded their dating profile. So I don't know if anyone has heard of the site Tinder. It's like a dating profile site, people match on it. So a person found every single person that they'd ever tried to match with. There was a list of that was out there forever, right? And if you've seen the film Ex Machina, you can see how the list like that could be used. Essentially, the maker of a robot tried to program a robot that would be particularly persuasive to a given individual by basing it on the people that person found attractive, having a complete profile of anyone they'd ever found attractive. So these intimate details of our life are making our ordinary life an open book. But when it comes to actually understanding what these companies are doing with the data, they are all too often a closed book, right? They take advantage of trade secrecy, other laws, to keep us from knowing that. So some people look at Europe and they say, oh, well, now I can get all my data. I'm happy now, right? I got my data, it's transparent. But you don't know what they were doing with the data, right? We don't necessarily know who they sold the data to. You don't know the inferences they made about you. I mean, you may not be able to get that under the European law. It's still going to be litigated. So all of these things are very important, you know. And I think one of the things that my image here is the Bentham's panopticon. And the idea of the panopticon in Bentham's work was that you could essentially create the greatest human happiness for a group of prisoners by having them arrayed in this sort of cell, and I'll use this to move around. And each prisoner would be in one of these. It's kind of like the Just Sleep Hotel, nearby, the Round Hotel. And you'd have one person, and there'd be a one-way mirror. The person could look out and see any particular prisoner, but no prisoners could see if they're being watched, right? And this is sort of resonated as this was just a fantasy of Bentham in the 1820s or so, I think. But then Foucault wrote about how many social systems were becoming more and more like this. And now I think what we're seeing is that we're reaching the perfection of this panopticism. Now, here are some lessons since publication in 2015. What's astonishing, and this has been a theme of my career, no matter how bad I think it is, it's much worse. Right? I mean, I've always found what's so funny is when I first started writing about this stuff in 2006, I had this response of, you know, you're paranoid, you know, you think everything's arrayed against us, and et cetera. And just over time, more and more things come out. That it dribs and drabs, but it accumulates. I also, though, I have to admit, I overestimated the ability and willingness of government to address it. And this was a problem because I thought that certain entities in the US at least and elsewhere were minding the store, were trying to control the data flows. But I found that they were quite ineffective. And that's something that I've been working through about, you know, how do you deal with that, right? And I actually had a good talk. I got to meet some folks from GovZero in Taiwan. It was a very interesting group. And they work more and more on empowering citizens in the absence of some government interventions that they may want. And I think that's something we need to look at increasingly. But I have also other ideas that I'll get into. But you know, this talk could get very dry if I just spoke in the abstract. So I want to talk about something very concrete, and that's Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. Because I imagine everyone's been following that, and I've noticed that Facebook seems to be in wide use here. Right? There's a lot of people who use Facebook around Taiwan, and so you know, let's think about this company that you know I use it too, and what has it done for us. So here's the core of the scandal of Cambridge Analytica. The idea was that essentially there were 320,000 US voters who were paid on Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform to take a personality test. Okay? And the personality test would identify things like neuroticism, openness, how emotional the person is, etc. This test itself is quite useful because what you can do with the test, first of all, is you can extrapolate from the nature of the person taking it and their level of each of these emotional categories to other people like them. So if you find, for example, that people that like country music, who live in a small town, who in a certain state in America are generally neurotic and closed, or whatever your categories would be of them, you can extrapolate this identity to others, right? And you can build your ads on that. So if you find out that someone's really scared of one thing, you can do an ad to scare them, like motivate them because of this. Well, this app collects the data, and what was very odd about Facebook was that it allowed people, once you were friends with someone, that person could share not only their data, but a lot of your data, okay? Was anyone aware of that when you signed up for Facebook, that when you friended someone that they could share not just their data, but your data too? People did know. Well, congratulations. This is a very smart crowd. Most people don't know, right? I mean, most people are just like, la, 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 you know, just sign up. And so this is a problem, I think. The personality quiz results were paired with their Facebook data to seek out psychological patterns, right? So the idea is, can we find these patterns? And I've written about this in the context of the emotional manipulation experiment, where they tried to see, can we make people happier or sadder by showing certain stories to them or not showing them certain stories, right? So this personality could, ultimately, the algorithms combine the data with other sources to create this set of records of 2 million people in key states with hundreds of data points who could be shown the highly personalized advertising, right? So that's at the core. So you might wonder, well, what's the legal problem? Well, one of the issues here is that what's going on is that they are building audiences, segmenting them, creating messages, targeting those. And my position in 2015 was, let's have more transparency, right, so voters can understand this. I now think that's a pretty naive position, because I think that people are flooded with information, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, especially nowadays, given the contemporary political environment in the US, and I think in many other places, there's just an endless explosion of bizarre news you'd never expect, right? And who's going to care about these second or third order issues of who puts the ads out when you've got, children in concentration camps in the US, something like that? Who cares? Yeah, people don't care. So they've got too much else to worry about. So my position in 2018 is ban behavioral advertising. Stop this stuff, right? People don't want, when they polled voters in many areas, 82% don't want behavioral advertising. They just want to have regular advertising without deep psychological profiles of what can best manipulate them. This position is very popular in Europe. I'm frequently in Europe. It's almost impossible to advance in the United States. And it's interesting to think about how different the cultures of the two places will become, how different cultures become as a result of legal commitments. And this is something where I think the social sciences are particularly well positioned to study. The mutual reinforcement of legal values and social values, and how those two things interact. So to go a little bit further, here's a history of some of Facebook's troubling data practices. When it was merely the Facebook at Harvard, Mark Zuckerberg was amazed at how quickly people signed up for the program and gave him all sorts of data. And there was an I am conversation where he once was quoted saying, "They trust me, these dumb," word I can't say. Right? And a lot of people thought, well, this is just a youthful indiscretion, right? But I like the quote that, people often show you who they are once, believe them, right? And I think that what's happened is that that same attitude has essentially been expressed, or at least reflected, in Facebook's handling of a broad variety of issues with data. There was the sudden imposition of the newsfeed in 2006. People barely understood often what was going on exactly, when that was broadcast. In 2009 to 2011, there were broken promises to users about the scope of data sharing. But in 2011, there was a settlement from the Federal Trade Commission in the US. And this is something I describe in my book. And Facebook promised not to mislead the users again. There was monitoring imposed, and there was risk of big fines if they did do what they had done before, right? And some of the things they would do is they would tell people, don't worry, only your friends can see this. But in fact, friends of friends could see it, right? And there are at least 5 examples of that where it was a direct misrepresentation or lie to the consumers, right? What's remarkable too is that this initial presentation of punishment, it has to be like in scare quotes, punishment. It's not really a punishment. It's just sort of, we're going to monitor you, don't do it again, right? Well, what whistleblowers revealed is the complete ineffectiveness of the regulation here, okay? What was happening in 2012 is that Facebook really needed to lure apps to the mobile platform. It was a desperate sort of do-or-die moment for the company. They didn't have the money to pay people to be on it, right? Certain companies pay people to be part of their network to accelerate network effects. They didn't have that, so they paid them with your data. They said you can have wildly expansive data access. And one of the key Facebook whistleblowers now, a guy who was in charge of this cooperation with third-party app developers, Sandy Parakilis, he alerted management. He said, look, folks, there's no auditing. We have no idea what's going on with this stuff. So when Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg say, you could never have known, who would have guessed Cambridge Analytica would have done such terrible things with the data? Well, people knew. People at the very top levels knew. And either there's willful blindness at the top, or complete lack of responsibility. But we have legal concepts for attributing responsibility in those situations, right? If I throw a brick off a building and it hits somebody and it kills them, I'm responsible. That's depraved heart murder. Okay? It's not like I can say, I didn't know where it's going to go, right? And these sorts of legal principles are incredibly important in an age of artificial intelligence and machine learning, because there are so many efforts by corporations to say that AI and machine learning, we don't understand how it works, it's mysterious. We're not responsible. They are responsible. Or at least we have to make them responsible unless we're going to be in a quite dangerous age. So this is the Wild West. Okay, they're not actually abiding by the settlement, I think. So who fills the vacuum? Well, one of the firms is Cambridge Analytica, right? And one of the key things to understand here, and this is a really important lesson about contemporary politics, is that you have right-wing billionaires. Some of them are so secretive we barely even have any pictures of them. Okay? It's like they're really secretive, but they have tons of money. And someone like Steve Bannon, who works with Alexander Nix, to be part of this group, I think it was SCL, that specialized in swinging elections in small countries. So people would come to it and say, we want this guy to win in Kenya. Our business would really do well if you can get this guy to win for president in Kenya. And SCL would go down. And one of the things they would do particularly is they would exacerbate social tensions. They would say, you know, about minority groups in the country. They're trying to take over, watch out for them, etc. Right? This is their specialty. So you have this sort of both Brexit and Trump were using the data that I showed in the first slide about Cambridge Analytica. They're all using it to micro-target things. Some of the themes of this scandal that I think are most important but overlooked in the press are behaviorism and shell companies. Okay? So let me start with behaviorism. And this book, by the way, this Re-Engineering Humanity, brilliant book of philosophy of technology about the way in which people can be manipulated. But one thing I was writing about back in 2015 in a piece called Facebook's Model Users was how Facebook was trying to create people along a certain model, to be a certain way. And that the ability to have such intensive monitoring of individuals makes it possible for a company to modulate them, and then for political actors and state actors to use the company to modulate people, to control them, or if not control them, to at least influence them very intimately. The second thing that's very important is that at the time, no one really understood what the relationships were between Mercer, Bannon, you know, they barely understood exactly what's going on with the data and the relationships between these entities. And that is the theme of the Black Box Society in Chapter 4, which is shell companies. So in this diagram, for example, and I'm sorry for its small size, you can see how, you know, you could, if you wanted to create an entity that could wreak havoc, but not have you be responsible for the havoc, you could get together and say, okay, here are 3 natural persons, John, Mary, and Tom. We're each going to own 33% of this thing, which will in turn own this thing, which will in turn own this thing, right? And in many parts of the world, including in the US states of Wyoming, Nevada, and Delaware, who owns this thing doesn't need to be revealed. This, again, is a way in which complex financial arrangements are laying the groundwork for autonomous organizations that will not be controlled by anyone. Imagine a car, an autonomous car that just goes around the city, does what it can, and no one knows who owns it, right? That would seem crazy. It would be crazy to have autonomous cars just running around Taipei, doing whatever, without being able to attribute that to someone. Well, we have that with financial institutions. We have that with shell companies. So you can develop these sort of incredibly complicated shell companies. This is a simple diagram. To really diagram some of this stuff, you would need 100 screens like this, right? If you're really good, if you're really rich, you buy 100 shell companies. You get bearer shares, etc. And I've published on exactly how to do this. And it's quite frightening, right? Of course, I mean, you might think, oh, that's a very menacing person, you know, he knows all this, but I mean, I don't have the money to do it, right? Only the very rich people can do this really well, but they do it with impunity, right? And that's a very worrisome thing. Now, here's another issue with respect to, it's not just about one political party winning and beating the other, right? On one level, you could say, well, you know, this is politics, right? And I often get this sort of very nonchalant response from people, where they say, That's what happens with politics. You just find new ways to beat the other side. People even point to the philosophy of Carl Schmitt, the jurist of Nazi Germany, who said that politics is about the friends and the enemies, right? But what's sad about what's going on, especially in this public sphere like Facebook, is that they are so cheap about understanding what's going on in the company that even state actors can get involved, right? So you have over 3,000 ads were purchased by Russian operatives tied to the Kremlin in 2016, reaching 126 million users, right? And the way they were reaching people, it wasn't like these were issue ads that said, we deeply disagree with the Obama administration's foreign policy with respect to Russian control of Antarctic Sea or Arctic Sea passages, right? It wasn't that. It was ads that basically, in certain areas, would say, people of a different race are trying to take your job, right? With gay rights saying, watch out, you know, gay people are gonna, against family values. And I guess tragically this is happening here too, right? This sort of effort to demonize, selectively demonize and target people. Strategic targeting to discourage democratic turnout. You have that as well going on, right? And this is all part of, this has been studied by the DARPA and Arizona State University as weaponized narrative, right? There's an effort to weaponize narrative, to tell certain stories. And what this does is it essentially means that the issues I'm talking about today are not just a consumer protection issue, they are a national security issue. Because to the extent you have what I call an automated public sphere, and this is one of the most important concepts I've had since Black Box Society, is that we have an automated public sphere that can be manipulated. To the extent that you have state actors out there that can manipulate it, they can do all sorts of things that really can mess up your country, right? And this is worrisome because, you know, some concrete examples of this, you know, I'm going a little bit beyond Facebook now, but it's the same sort of principle, is that you have these automated bots that can be out there and they can flood and overwhelm hashtags. So for example, during the election, one of the most viral stories in early September 2016 was a rumor that Hillary Clinton was about to die of Parkinson's, okay? And it was just out there. It became the trending topic. Endless number of people, quote unquote people, saying this is a problem, right? It turned out they were, you know, these were bots. It was being driven by fake accounts. What's astonishing in the US too, and this is where I think it's important to really learn from some of our errors, or some of the errors here, is that the First Amendment and free expression are used to protect the bots. So when you hear from people who say, I think a robot deserves free expression protection, or I think that, you know, algorithms deserve free expression protection, they think they are being progressive and the future and futuristic and helping technology advance. But what they're also inevitably doing is empowering some of the most disruptive and destructive elements in society to destroy a human sphere based on human beings, a public sphere based on human beings. And I've written for Columbia University a piece called Preventing a Post-Human Law of Freedom of Expression. Because I think the stakes are that high. It's either we reserve these spaces to human beings and human cognition, or we let them be overrun by the simulation of human cognition, which is quite worrisome. There's a parallel, by the way, in a recent book that was put out called Censor, Distraction, and Diversion Inside China's Great Firewall, which talks about flooding hashtags with inconvenient stories. So, you know, this is a widely used tactic that's in many different areas. YouTube is manipulable too. And this is something that I did catch in the Black Box Society. You go on YouTube sometimes, within a few clicks, you see bizarre conspiracy theories. It's because it's so manipulable. And there'll be a big story coming out pretty soon about just how manipulable YouTube is. I was just talking to some reporters about it. You'll be amazed at how easy it is to buy 10,000 views on a video, and then to push it up the algorithm, push it up the feed. So here's how the US government failed, okay? And here's something that I think is sort of a shocking failure, but it's something to really learn about, and it's something I want to bring up when I go to Canada, Europe, South America, I really am intent on bringing up this as one of the main problems of US enforcement, is that when the Federal Trade Commission determined in 2011 that Facebook was misleading it, they forced Facebook to sign an agreement to improve their data practices, but the agreement had ambiguous wording, and Facebook got to choose its own auditor. Okay? Now, if they're choosing an auditor, the auditor is selling its services in the market. So if you're trying to choose your own auditor, who would you pick? The easiest grader, right? You choose an easy person. And that's precisely what they did. The Pricewaterhousecoopers sort of gave them a pass on all sorts of things that I think should have been criticized. Okay? And what's amazing is that this report, there's an independent assessor's report on Facebook's privacy program, but the report itself, and I don't mean for anyone to read any of this slide, all I need to show is that when it was released, a lot of it was redacted. Okay? So to review the bidding, we had a black box technology company. The government says you've got to open up the black box to an auditor. The auditor produces a report. The report is now the black box. You know, and I mean, it's very frustrating. And I've also seen, another thing that just is so frustrating in this whole saga is academics who write and say, well, the FTC really shouldn't be fining Facebook without disclosing that they get money from Facebook. You know, that's another black box problem. And, you know, people have to dig around to find out, but it happens. So there's a bitter debate over this, you know, and Facebook clearly outlawyered the agency in 2012. And, you know, now, will the FTC do anything? No, I doubt it, right? It's got a very pro-business tilt under the current administration. So the last question is, you know, where do we go from here, right? And I should leave the last third of the talk for a more positive vision. So the scandal's not unique, okay? What I'm talking about here is really not a unique problem. It's not as if, oh, this is some egregious, terrible resolution or non-resolution to the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. A lot of what I discussed in Black Box Society had a similar outcome, you know? And oh, and by the way, people will say, oh, well, Facebook stock lost all sorts of right after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But it all bounced back, right? It was just an opportunity for people to buy at the bottom. I mean, that was all. So this is not, it's not as if there was any real punishment for what went on there. And with respect to the LIBOR scandal, predictive policing, fusion centers, these are all things I discussed in the book. They all involve misuse of data. None of them has really been punished that greatly. None of them, I mean, there's a few people that maybe went to jail for LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Offered Rate on interest rates, but not that much. So we need more creative or just direct solutions. One thing I strongly believe is that Europe is leading the way here. Okay? And this is a picture of Margareta Vestager, who is the European Competition Commissioner. And she has really emphasized the importance, first of all, of data protection, and secondly, of competition law. And these two things are directly related to one another, okay? Because to the extent there's no data protection, more and more data will go to the same big companies, and they will get bigger and bigger. But if you protect data, you make it harder for any one entity to control so much. And so what they're doing is, for example, they give people a right to erasure. You can erase certain data about yourself online. Okay? You have a right of data access. So remember those examples I gave where people found out they had thousands of pages of data on Facebook or Tinder or Google or what have you? It's really important. You need to know what data is there. There's the right to be forgotten, which I think is really an important right. It's important for people, and you know, some people say, well, there's a real tension between privacy law and free expression there. There is. But they are trying to essentially develop a reasoned way of dealing with it. Right? So one of the leading cases recently involved a woman whose husband was murdered in 1995, and when anyone searched for her name, all the search results would be about the murder of her husband. And she said, you know, look, 20 years later, I don't want this horrific event to define me online. Okay? In the US, she would be laughed out of court. They'd say Google has a First Amendment right to put up whatever it wants to say. In Europe, there's a humane response. And they say, let's balance between what's going on here and what the rights of the company and you, and we think that you have the right, essentially, to take that down. Just on the search on your name, right? It's not like the information goes away. It's still up there for other searches, on her husband's name, or what have you. It just goes away for if it's on her name. But when politicians have gone to get a right to be forgotten for, they say, oh, well, I had a scandal 5 years ago, and don't put it online. They say, no, we're keeping that online forever. You're a politician, you're a public figure. That's going to be on forever. And so that's the balance that's being struck. And I think it's a very constructive and good balance that's being struck. You know, I mean, obviously there's going to be some errors, but it's helpful. Another is the right to explanation. Okay, this is a really fascinating topic that some leading scholars here are working on, and I think this is something that is very helpful in terms of thinking about if you're profiled by a company, you get to demand an explanation of how you were profiled. So if the bank says, we don't think you deserve a loan, you get to say to them, why? Why don't I deserve a loan? They can't say to you, well, we have 50,000 data points about you, and they match the 50,000 data points that are like people that are bad with credit risks, right? And I think that's a good thing. I think they should actually have to explain in humanly understandable terms why that happened. With respect to competition law, we see serious fines in Europe, right? We see serious fines in the comprehensive approach to data dominance by big companies, where, in some countries, the fine for an antitrust violation might be very trivial, or the civil liability might be very small. In Europe, it can be 2 to 4% of the entire corporate turnover. And they've been willing to impose that. And so I think that's very positive. Another thing that I think is useful is the civil society groups that are pushing for algorithmic accountability. So there's the Freedom from Facebook campaign of the Open Markets Institute. Their first demand is that we split up Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Okay? The idea is that we really need, one company shouldn't be in charge of all those things, right? The second thing they say is no more Facebook acquisitions of firms like TBH. Now, has anyone heard of the polling app TBH here? No, right? And this is what Facebook does with a lot of little social networks. Just when they get to the point where they might be a threat, they buy them, right? And this is very troubling because under current antitrust doctrine, at least in the United States, if a merger is less than $82 million, I think it's around that figure, $78, $82 million, there's no merger review to look at the effect on competition. So it just goes ahead, and the agencies it's very rare they would ever challenge it afterward. But what that allows the company like Facebook to do is just to buy up any potential competitor. And we have to watch out for that. We have to make sure that that doesn't happen. And I encourage many authorities and jurisdictions to just say no. Just say, well, no, you can't operate it here. You can't. And I think that's an area where antitrust law needs to evolve. Another is data portability and interoperability. Oh, I should say also what TBH was. TBH actually was solving a pretty interesting problem, which it was called a positivity polling app. So the idea behind TBH was you could put up a poll, but people could only say nice things about it. So there's a demand for this, right? Because there's lots of cyberbullying and other things. So, this is a creative idea. It's a creative idea and it deserves to sort of live or die on its own rather than just being snapped up. Another is data portability and interoperability. If you could carry your phone number from carrier to carrier, why not carry your profile from social network to social network? There's complications there. It's not an easy interoperability problem, but again, there are people working on it in computer science departments and law schools here that are doing very important work and making this a potential reality. Another proposal that's a little more adventurous is to separate news and social. Okay? So a lot of people, they say, I want to leave Facebook. They get mad about something, but they say, I can't leave it because all my brother's baby pictures are up there, right? Or I won't get invited to the big party, right? This has happened to me. It just happened to me last month. I try to check Facebook like once a week when I'm in the US. Here I check a little bit more because I'm a messenger. But because I do that, I miss the party had been rescheduled for another night. So I go to my friend's house and it's like, oh, the party's on Friday night. Like, oh, okay. So this is a problem, right? And one of the proposals that was put out by Masej Siglowski was to say, why not separate and say, well, you could have a news feed and a social feed, but you can choose to only get one of them, right? Or you could choose other ways of, you could separate it out. Because I'd like to just get stuff from my friends, like certain content, etc. And a lot of that's about the power of the user to define their own experience, right? And there's all sorts of ways in which government can do that. Government can force a more open system. It can force restaurants to put up the calorie count in food. You know, it could force Facebook to be a bit more open here. And there's parallel structural rules here in banking I can get into later. Another thing I think that's important is that we need to have a new political economy of technology. Okay? I think that this, without really strong state intervention, the same very large firms will continue to have vast and growing influence over culture, politics, and economy. And these are all really interrelated. And I've been trying to describe this dynamic at a blog called the LPE blog, Law and Political Economy blog, because I think that we need to realize that some of these companies are becoming like governments. And this is the concept of functional sovereignty. So for example, on YouTube, Google decides which videos can be monetized and which cannot, right? Some videos can make money off of ads, some cannot. That's a really important decision, but there's not really a very robust process for them to do it in a consistent or fair way. Similarly with things being taken down from Facebook, you know, various pictures, other images that get taken down from Facebook, news stories sometimes. Each of these are indications that these companies are becoming like sovereigns. And I think that's particularly evident in the Chinese social credit scoring system that's being implemented and proposed, right? I mean, if you have essentially private companies that can create a blacklist that can say, you can't travel, or you can't stay in a hotel, you can't be in an airline, that's like a determination made by a state. Now, admittedly, in the US, it's made by a state, by the federal government, and it's not that reviewable either, right? So, you know, I'm not trying to say, oh, this is a terrible system, and, you know, we know how to do it right or something. What I'm saying is that whether it's done by a technology company or by the government itself, people deserve a chance to object, to get some hearing about what's going on. Some of the early reports about the Chinese social credit scoring system are that there's no appeal, and so people have no chance to actually say, oh, the data's wrong, right? And some people may say, oh, well, it's only 2 million people affected out of 1.3 million. No, but that's a lot of people. You know, we really have to be sure that these systems have some level of human intervention and control, and that's, I think, part of the European right of explanation, almost a right to a human in the loop, a right to have some human being accountable. And that's one thing that I think, you know, it even ties into debates about automation and robotics. Because people say, oh, what are we going to do when the robots take all the jobs? Well, there's going to need to be a lot of people to make sure the robots are acting in a fair and accountable way, right? And that, I think, is going to be part of the future of the political economy here. Another post that I did recently there is called The Dark Side of the Data-Driven. And in that post, I try to emphasize that although data can be very good and used for good, a lot of times data is used to oppress or to control people. We have to be very careful about, you know, who we take data from and how we use it. Okay? So I promised you the black hole metaphor, so here we go. And I actually have to confess, I was inspired both by this researcher named Nicole DeWandre and by the Liu Xijin series, Free Body Problem, because I think it's interesting to sort of think about astronomical metaphors for what we experience. And what DeWandre has talked about is she said that there's a hypergravity to the social in today's world. And the idea of this hypergravity is that it used to be you would do something and, you know, no one was watching, or maybe a few people were watching, and they'd remember, and it would just fly off into the ether, it wouldn't matter. But now, knowing that so much data is collected about us, and so many powerful entities have that data, it's kind of oppressive. And it has a risk of becoming more oppressive with time. Particularly when we look at the implementation of ed tech in schools. There are now schools in the US where people just get into buildings with iris scans, right? In China, I think it's gone a little bit further with respect to some experiments that give a report to a teacher each day of how much the student was actually looking in the right direction, how much the student had their head down, whether the student looked happy, sad, upset, etc. And to think that, you know, every single moment of your life, whether at school or work, could be under the eye of a surveillance camera that is continually keeping the feed forever, or even worse, algorithmically processing it as a score for how good you are. It this gravity metaphor is very helpful. And then to think about how that weighs people down, how it sort of is a weight on creativity, etc. And I think also that this leads to centripetal flows of data that are self-reinforcing. Essentially, the more data you get in certain companies, the more data those companies, the more money they make off of that data, the more money they have to deploy surveillance and to analyze the data, and then the more data they gather. So it's a self-reinforcing process. And this is where I think the metaphor of the black hole is actually kind of interesting, because it gives you a sense of all sorts of human activities and interactions are being sort of sucked into, metaphorically, sucked into this zone of algorithmic evaluation that is an assault on freedom in many respects, right? You can imagine a version of the social credit system where it's not just your score that's determined. Your score is determined by your friend's score, and vice versa. Your score will affect your friend's score. And political activities could be part of that, right? That's already in US databases. There are lists kept of people with suspect political views. And if we imagine a world where your social credit is somehow calculated by a black box entity, that tying into your life chances, and not merely your life chances, but the life chances, the ability of your friends to travel, to be free, to get a job, etc. And knowing that anything you did out of line that could affect the score would instantly affect your friends' scores, and that they would know that it was you who affected them. That's a very scary setup, right? That, I think, is a black hole of compressing human possibility. It's, to use the, and I'm sorry if I'm spoiling, well, this won't spoil the three-body problem for anybody, but to use a metaphor towards the end, what's brilliant about the science fiction trilogy is that it sort of imagines the heat death of the universe through a series of two-dimensional attacks. Essentially, the most advanced societies figure out in physics how to reduce everything to 2 dimensions. Once they put a 2-dimension bomb somewhere, everything gets compressed into it. Okay? And I think it's a wonderful metaphor for thinking about what would it look like if you had 1 or 2 companies ruling commerce, ruling search, ruling social media, governing all of our daily interactions. Okay? It sort of is flattening human experience into the binaries of the algorithm. It's the one thing to always remember about the algorithm, and why I think that, why I'm long human beings. I'm not shorting human beings, I'm long human beings. So I think that ultimately the algorithmic is about and or not. It all boils down to these very simple binaries. But life is more complex than that. And I think we can avoid that flattening of human experience to scores, to binaries of good or bad, etc., by a few powerful entities, if we're willing to step in and regulate, to disperse power, and to help individuals understand the online world and not merely be affected or shown by it. So with that, here's my contact information. I'd love to be in touch, and thank you so much for coming to talk today. Thanks.
请各位给Professor Pasquale 一个更热烈的掌声，好吗？好，那我们接下来要进行提问与讨论，那希望各位继续踊跃参与。OK，Professor Hong, please, this is the Q&A time. Thank you.
Thank you, audience. And this has been a wonderful setup. First of all, we have a really nice venue for everybody to be here, comfortably listening to your talk. And also, we have a luxury of time for an hour for really a good opportunity for the audience to have comments and questions. And this is quite unusual for an academic talk to have this long time. So please, audience, do we want to use do we have anybody? will you run the microphone, right? Yep. So, please, you can ask your question or comments in English and Chinese. Okay, so please, yeah, 2 choices. Yes.
My apologies.
Yeah, so because we have the time, we can take 1 question at a time, then Professor Pasquale will address that immediately. How's that? Okay, we have someone here, please. Yeah, please use the microphone. Can we briefly just address who you are? Because we have a very diverse audience today. We have technologists, friends from the law department, NCC, National Communication Commission, and a lot of different parties. So please, thank you.
Professor Pasquale, thank you for your great presentation. I'm very happy to meet you again. Yes, my name is Thomas Chen. I am from National Jiaotong University School of Law. I quite agree with your opinion that behavior applied in politics is a national security issue. However, I think your idea that we should ban behavior applied in politics, this is inspiring idea. My question is, the first, of course, I think the first concept to come to my mind would be constitutional freedom of political speech. Yeah. The second question is that the enforcement issue. Of course, Facebook or other big companies that are located in the United States, so the U.S. government can enforce law to control those companies. From Taiwan's perspective, we face many problems when we deal with Facebook. Their server is not in Taiwan. So therefore, when a company, also, as you know that when GDPR getting effective in May, Facebook decided to shift the data to other locations, to other countries outside GDPR's jurisdictions. So I wonder, how do you put your idea in mind? Do you have any suggestion or say?
Great to see you again, Thomas. And I wanted to, it's a terrific question. And so I'll give one simple response that may be unsatisfying, and then a broader reflection on the issues you're raising. The simple response is to go after the people who do the advertising rather than Facebook. Right? So you could the force of the law could apply to the candidate as opposed to Facebook itself. Right? And there are good free expression principles to help people find audiences. So you could, for example, create exceptions to say you can find certain types of audiences in a very coarse-grained way, right? If I want to find, say, a certain group of people who are, say, I want to advertise my position on Medicare, people who are between 50 and 65, sure, that could be an exception to this. I want to find a certain number of people that are have been to a certain school and say, I'm going to support that school. Sure, that would be fine. I think you'd have to register that to make sure everyone understood that that was what you were doing. But what I find problematic are the behavioral advertising that is bringing together either psychological profiles, other forms of profiling that are manipulative. And I think that there's going to be very difficult lines to draw there. But I would empower a commission to do something like that, and then to fine, if there are fines to be had, to fine the candidate and not to apply the law to Facebook. Because you're right, Facebook is very good at evading the law or trying to say that it can't provide data that I think it could provide. It's your example of the GDPR, the regulatory arbitrage to avoid the force of the GDPR is a good one. And it's just like the example of choosing its own auditor, right? It's like it gets to choose its own jurisdiction for where the law applies and choose its own auditor. And that's an area where the data world has followed a very bad precedent of the financial world. Right? So when we think about the Panama Papers and secrecy jurisdictions, tax havens, these things are a scourge. These should not exist. I do not believe there should be these sort of tax havens where people just hide money, hide what they have, because they're just a recipe for tax evasion and for avoiding, and they're a recipe for accelerating inequality. Because if you're a person with, $500,000 or much less, certainly a person with $50,000, there's no way that person is going to be able to find a tax haven, right? Whereas if you're a person who has billions, that person quite easily find them. And so I think that these are very troubling things, and we can't allow the global anarchy of tax havenry to apply to data havenry. We've already had some problems with that in Europe in terms of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner's Office. At the beginning, they used to have, Ireland had an office for data protection that was just basically an old storefront in the middle of nowhere. And the message was, bring your business to Ireland, we're an easy jurisdiction, we're not going to penalize you, right? We can't allow that. We can't allow that race to the bottom, because the race to the bottom is going to be zero regulation rather than smart regulation. So I hope that there's an effort to avoid that data arbitrage and to impose some forms of order on these companies, because I think that they are, whatever the attempted legal separation of the company from the country, their effects are here. And they need to, and also they should adjust. They should have, Facebook Brazil, Facebook Taiwan, Facebook Portugal, Facebook Germany. Those should all be very different places, I think, or work by different rules. Because when I often hear think tanks in the US say, what about internet freedom? What about one global public sphere? But it's very, I think, disingenuous language, because that one global public sphere is being determined by, 320-somethings in Silicon Valley, California. They're not bringing in people from around the world like ICANN does, right? You have like ICANN and other entities sort of bring in people from around the world to talk about. Internet Engineering Task Force could be another one where you have some model of like respecting the plurality of the world. The whole world is an American, and so I think that's part of the problem. Is like, how do we do that? How do we respect the plurality of jurisdictions as opposed to subsuming them in this sort of two-dimensional, even one-dimensional attack of very large companies that get to govern untrained? Yes.
Frank, nice to meet you again. You're talking about that actually is Taiwan is in a very unique position in the international forum. You're talking about ICANN, but you know the NTIA actually doing the survey trying to take the INA back.
Yes.
So we don't know what is turn out eventually. But when we are talking about like this black box society, of course the big company actually play a kind of quite dominant role. I go through all the, the Amazon Alexa ranking. China is might be the only country. The Google and the Facebook is not dominant in China. But China also dominates in certain things. But really threatening to me is when we are developing some kind of theory in legal or whatever, but you put it into the China society is very different, really different, because the person behind the thing is government, it's China government. Whatever you're talking about, for example, we know that the China government forced the Apple computer, sell their service data center to the China company. But It's a funny thing, the same thing in here in Taiwan. We have a similar thing like, some people already mentioned about. There is a couple of the department, particularly, the Department of what we call, is, the finance departments. They try to correct the tax, so they want the data localization in Taiwan. They are asking the company making the data localization in Taiwan. But when you are talking about the data localization in Taiwan, then you have to go further to talking about the digital sovereignty issues. And digital sovereignty issue, I think, in the international forum, China and Russia continue pushing the idea. And who can really maintain the digital sovereignty in the reality is the China Great Wall. And they can really enforce such a rule. And so many of the government, not only, even in the South Asia, right now actually China try to sell the internet Great Wall to the other government in South Asia. And this is quite threatening. Actually, it's even more evil than the black box.
No, I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the perspective, and I remember you also inspired me. I remember when I was last here, you told me that I needed to think more about the Chinese internet companies. But now you're saying I just need to think about the Chinese government, so that's helpful. It's simplifying it. No, but I get your point. And I do think that the data localization issue is really interesting, right? Because one of the things I'm thinking about that is, on the one hand, I can certainly imagine at free trade talks, the US trade representative is going to be pushing very hard against data localization. They're going to say, look, we want people to be able to use our big internet companies all around the world, right? And one thing I wonder is that, and this is something where we'd have to discuss this technically, because you would have the technical knowledge far greater than me to think about the reality of this. But I think about the way in which the Snowden revelation showed how there could be government access to telecommunications channels. So what I wonder is, even let's say that the US approach or the data globalization approach wins in the next few years, and all this data could go from China to wherever it wants to be. It would seem to be relatively straightforward for the Chinese government to have, or any government, certainly it's been proven in the US case under the Snowden revelations, to take a copy of everything and put it in its own server, right? So I wonder, to what extent does the data localization and globalization debate map to concerns of privacy? Because it seems like technically there would be other routes of access by a government authority. And I'm thinking of some of the slides that Snowden revealed about how the US NSA would have versions of the man-in-the-middle attack or something, between different entities. So I think that's my initial sort of, fatalist take on the data localization, globalization issue. I do think you're right to say that one of the things that's a profound problem of black box scholarship, and it's often called in the US agnotology. Agnotology is this word for the production of ignorance. We think of education as the production of knowledge, but there's also a systematic production of ignorance that goes on out there. You see it in climate change denial. You see it with tobacco companies saying for decades that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. Okay? There's a lot of agnotology and production of ignorance out there. And I think that the problem often is that a company or a government can get something exposed, and the exposure leads to all this big frenzy, and there's more exposure, and everyone is looking at what is apparent, and they're not looking at the deeper problem. So you're absolutely right to say that because there are some rudimentary institutions of accountability and exposure in America, people like me can become obsessed with that and miss the big picture, right? And that's actually on the first page of Black Box Society. I use the metaphor of the the drunk under the lamppost. I think it's an incredibly important metaphor. It's the story of a drunk guy is walking along the street at night, and he's looking for his keys. He always looks under the lampposts. And the guy says, "Why are you looking under lampposts? No one looks under lampposts. No one walks by lampposts with their keys." He says, "Yeah, but that's the only place where the light is," right? And this is a problem with a lot of academic areas, right? A lot of academic areas, the research agenda is driven by easy access to the data sometimes. And that's a fundamental epistemological bias that we have to overcome. And I did often say, in the wake of the Snowden revelation, I said, who's the Snowden of Goldman Sachs? Who's the Snowden of China? Who's the Snowden of Russia, right? And to the extent that certain entities are able to avoid public disclosure by brutality, right? If you make it clear to everybody in the country that if you expose the country's secrets, your family would be disappeared or something like that, that's a very, and I'm not saying that I know of that as the regime in any particular place, but if that is what's done, that's a route to power. So you're right to say that, and I've tried to rectify that a bit. I met with someone who recently wrote an essay in the Hong Kong Review of Books called The Red Stack. It's about, the Chinese internet infrastructure. And it is something I'm trying to address in future works, so thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pasquale. I'm Yi Xian, a postdoc researcher at the Research Institute for Social Science and Humanities. So I was really struck by the first line of the handout, which is your blog article, in which you say that the political economy of digitalization is a broad topic. When I enter, I was like, whoa, okay, that's really interesting claim. But along the line in your talk, you also mentioned that we probably need a new political economy of technology. And I sort of get how you are pondering on this dilemma, from transparency to your proposal just ban the predatory, personalized advertisement. I feel like there's a real move here from transparency. It's probably a little more political economy based, still there's this belief that technology or digitalization itself carries some merit. So if we all make it democratized, then maybe transparency sort of help. That's how I understand the proposal of transparency, maybe. I am still very fond of that idea. But in your talk, such as you mentioned about Silicon Valley, or when we're talking about the Chinese government itself, the state, the role of the state and the political economy of the state has drastically changed in our age. A lot of people call it it's a corporate state, or you mentioned about the sovereign role that companies like Amazon or Google play in our life. So I feel like it's still very political economy of technology, especially in digitalization. And also our solutions against this black box seems still, it's very political economy driven kind of resolution or possibility to imagine in the future. So I wonder, how do you, I would just love to hear more on that aspect. Thank you.
Sure, and I want to make it really concrete, this idea of the political economy of large firms and how we can respond to it. And so I'll give a very basic example, but I think it discloses a lot of complexity. So with Amazon, our delivery service, I don't know what the biggest delivery service is here, I need to research that, but at least in the US, the Amazon is quite big. And a lot of times, if you order something, you might be dissatisfied with it, and you might want to return it, right? But there could be a dispute as to whether you get to return it, who pays for the shipping, all sorts of things like that. And it's not very well understood how those disputes are resolved, right? It's not as if, and it's not like you could just take it to court, because who's going to take something to court for a very cheap amount, very little money? So Amazon's going to decide that. Now, I will often shop at Amazon. I'll route lots of money through it. I know people look a little shocked. I'll confess, I do this. Why do I do it? Well, one reason is, I mean, I personally think that, I mean, and I just, in the link in the piece that I just distributed, I talk about this difference between competition, trying to create more competition, and regulating public utilities. I think most of these firms will end up like public utilities. You know, I love the idea that maybe there'll be competition eventually. I don't look for it very much. So if my bet is that the firm's just going to get bigger and bigger and more powerful, I want to be an important person to the firm. You know what I'm saying? Because I realize that if I'm someone that spends, say, $1,000 a year at Amazon, they'll be more likely to try to keep me than someone who spends $5 a year. So in a way, we can think of it as, imagine in the court dispute, I handing the judge $100 under the table and saying, well, I'd like you to decide in my favor, right? We all know that's illegal and terrible. That's a bribe, that's very bad, right? Although I did have some time in Peru in the 1990s when they told me that's how the court cases were decided. But you know, hopefully Peru is moving on that. You know, but at least the judge that they were talking about, the courts they were talking about. But you know, this is a real problem, I think, in terms of thinking about how. But with respect to Amazon, a lot of people don't think it's a problem if, for example, the Amazon internal dispute resolution system is tilted toward people that spend a lot, right? Customer loyalty or something. And so what I think is important to a political economy approach is to realize that increasingly these companies will become the really important legal system in our daily lives. I used to teach copyright law, and I stopped teaching it in 2009. And the reason I stopped teaching is I told the students, look, for 26 weeks or 23 weeks, we go over the US code in the court cases. And then I print out the Spotify and Apple terms of service, and I put it out and I say, this is the copyright law of the 21st century, right? It doesn't matter what the code is, it doesn't matter what the court cases are. 99.9% of disputes are going to be settled by the company. It's either going to settle in your favor or the artist's favor or something like that. So it's similar with YouTube, etc. And this is to me like our Magna Carta. You know, when Runnymede in England, the lords got together and said, we are demanding of the king that you abide by certain rules before you take our land away. And I think that's what we similarly have to organize to do, is to get government, well, it still has some power left, as it has some power, to give us certain rights. So that, for example, those dispute resolution systems are fair, that they're not sort of skewed by that. Because if they are skewed by, for example, who spends the most money at Amazon, what type of a system is that? It's just a system where the rich get richer, right? If you're someone that can manage to spend tons of money, well, then they treat you well. If you're someone who can't spend much money, they treat you very poorly. So this is where I think that we have to bring very abstract discussions of power, sovereignty, due process, etc., down to our lived experience and to our understanding of power. And to me, the fundamental problem with a lot of contemporary economics is that it does not look at power as a significant part of the equation. Power is so important. And so to have governments sort of equalizing these power relations, I think, really helps. Thank you, it's a great question.
I studied law in NTU. While I studied law, I think the real question here is not a legal question, because it's very easy to make those giant companies to apply the law, since they can hire many legal consultants. So the real and high question here, I think, the ethical question, since they benefit so much from Earth, but we benefit so much less, so much little from them. So there are some scholars in USA are arguing about or proposing about the new issue about taxing their data collecting business. If the government takes on it and redistribute this wealth from the company to those who in need, something like for the literacy problem or for the digital gap, can we or can you compromise or satisfy this kind of tax part text proposed to make you something called the new political economy context if the government using this kind of context to making enforce and make the wealth they collect from us to distribute to those who in need. So can you just be happy to evaluate? Because I think it's very difficult to make lawsuit for them because they can always hire some talented lawyers or make their company legal. So what makes us terrifying or unhappy or unsatisfying maybe it's the ethical problem. So is it okay for you to answer?
That's a great question. So the question about taxation, leveling the playing field. I think that there's a couple levels to that. I mean, I think first of all, there's a clear case that data and immense aggregations of data should be taxed, and the proceeds, at the very least, reserved to help pay for the damage caused by data breaches, right? So there's going to be a lot of damage from data breaches in the future. There already has been damage from it. And nowadays, a lot of times if there's a big data breach, at least in the US, say people get their identity stolen. It's just thought that, well, that's your problem. Now you've got to spend maybe 5, 10, 15 hours trying to get everything straightened out about your identity. Well, why not tax the people that hold data? It's a predictable event that's going to happen. Keep a reserve fund, pay people to solve this problem, right? It's like, this again is like when I hear that, like, oh, the jobs are running out, thanks to automation. It's like, no, it's just that we've all been given like 3 extra jobs. Now you have to watch out for your data. You've got to keep a good social media profile. You got to make sure that the first Google result on your name isn't a bad thing. You've got all these jobs now that you didn't used to have, right? Sometimes with IKEA, you even have to make your own furniture. So I feel like this sort of thing is I run together a few things, but I think that this is very important because it's predictable. And one of my colleagues at Maryland, Danielle Citron, actually wrote an article called Reservoirs of Danger. And she talks about how in the 19th century, when farms would put together a huge reservoir of water, sometimes these reservoirs, the dam would break, the water would come through and destroy everybody's house, right? Or just flood everyone's house. They would put money away sometimes and say, we've got to reserve money or have an insurance bond or something, so that we know that 1 in 100 times the dam will break, the water will get out, etc. We know the exact same thing with data. We know that it's going to get out eventually, but at least probabilistically, some of it will get out and cause damage. And I think that's important to address. But I think your question was about something much larger, which is the degree of power and money, the degree of power that money confers to these firms. And it is troubling. And I think that, if you look at the battle between the US and Europe over Apple's taxation and other internet companies and how, these companies use extremely sophisticated techniques to avoid taxes, that's troubling too. And I have another colleague named Andrew Blair Stanek that's working on this, and I'll explain how he does this. It's brilliant. A way these companies will avoid taxes is they will say, well, we have this intellectual property, and to the tax authorities they'll say, but it's not worth that much. Our intellectual property, it's worth maybe $1 billion, $2 billion, etc. So don't tax us too much on that, right? But then when they have a patent lawsuit or other lawsuits, if someone infringes their intellectual property, they say, oh, it's worth $100 billion. It's worth so much, right? And so what my colleague Andrew says is that for evaluation purposes, there has to be horizontal parity evaluation. So if you tell the tax collector it's worth $1 billion, then if you ever sue for intellectual property infringement, it's worth $1 billion for that purposes too. So this, I think, helps with the black box problem because it creates authoritative representations of value that avoid the sort of the problem of people lying about their revenues or the value of what they own, etc. The last example I think I would give is that, we have to avoid allowing the companies to, we should look at the value created or captured by these companies as value that's not entirely their own creation, And this gets a bit philosophical, but, when you use Google for a search, and let's say you choose the 3rd search result instead of the first one, On one level, that's a good thing, you know, for you, that you use the search engine and you got the right result on the first page. But you're also working for Google, right? You're telling Google, hey, that third result is better than the first result, at least for people like me in my area, right? It's a form of labor. And there was a fight by feminist scholars in the 1970s to say that housework should be waged. We should get wages for housework, right? And this is a very interesting concept because in a way, a scholar reviewed my book, Black Box, and a feminist scholar, and she titled part of the review, Welcome to the World of Women. And her idea was that many of the forms of exploitation that I had chronicled in the digital realm were forms of exploitation that were suffered by many women. And that if you applied feminist scholarship to it, you'd understand it better. I totally agree with her. I mean, I've been reading a lot of feminist accounting and other studies since then. I think it's very interesting, you know, how the work of social reproduction can be unwaged. And it's vital work, it's really important work. And so I think that what we do when we use Facebook and Google, I mean, Facebook in a way is social reproduction, right? You know, we're doing emotional labor. If I see it's somebody's birthday, I click like, happy birthday, you know. Maybe I'm a little bit of a curmudgeon, I bet, but you know, but it's a bit of labor, right? I mean, it creates all this email, all this work you have to do. And so I think that all of us, to an extent far greater than was the case with prior technological development, we create the product. And you see that in the famous contrast between Instagram and Kodak, right? Kodak photography employed 100,000 people for decades, right? And then Instagram, when it was bought by Facebook, had, I think, 13 employees. Well, it started with 13, and then it had like maybe 100, maybe 1,000 or something, right? And people might say, oh my God, computers are so great. Like now, one person can do the work of 1,000. But it's not one person doing the work of 1,000. It's all of us putting up the photos on Instagram. I mean, I've already put up 600. I've done my part, you know. Liking people's photos, so we know what to prioritize, right? Something gets a lot of likes, prioritize that. Gets less likes, don't prioritize it. All of that argues in favor of taxation for firms that are essentially co-opting free labor or colonizing the labor of people at work. Just think about it. There's all these people in offices, they're not doing their job, they're looking at Facebook. So they're, rather than working for their boss, they're working for Facebook, right? So there's all these sorts of ways in which, if we are creative about our concept of value, we can create this new political economy, right? This is one reason why I'm giving an address to the International Association of Accountants in Edinburgh this year. People might think, oh, accounting, what a boring topic, right? Accounting. I mean, I've been reading all the people that say, oh, accounting will all be computers eventually. I don't think so. I think accounting is very political. It's very political, it involves a lot of judgment calls, it allows a lot of like philosophy, how you value things, etc. You know, so, I mean, I think that at least with respect to like high-level rules, I'm not saying the life of the average accountant is a glamorous adventure, but I think it is quite an interesting topic. So just, I know it's a very long response, but I think my bottom line is to completely affirm your line of questioning, and to say that, yes, we have to really rethink taxation in terms. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thanks for your wonderful presentation. I appreciate it. Actually, I also read through your book, Black Box Society, but actually, 2 points is not very clear for me. The first, you talk about the balance between the reputations and the privacy or the freedom of speech, and then you also think about the European Union, the right to be forgotten. It seems comfortable to you, but actually, I think one thing concerns me, because if we grant such kind of a huge discretion to the Google, there was worry about that Google will be the new censorship. That's my first point. And my second question, I also thinking about when we debate the public data use or something like that, we think about two approaches. The first is regulation or deregulation. It seems that you are approach of the regulation, but actually you think about regulation, that means you will put much forward to the people, to personnel, to regulate it. But we think about the the regulatory captures issue. That means we trust the watcher to watch out the Google, but who watched the watcher? So yeah, so it also concerns me. So would you elaborate for me? Thank you.
All right, two tough questions. So I think with the, let me start with the right to be forgotten, because I think that's a little bit more straightforward. I think that without the right to be forgotten, Google has all the power, right? If there's not a right to be forgotten, then it's just up to Google, and there's no you can't take the Google's decision and challenge it to the government. You can't go to the government and challenge the decision. With the right to be forgotten, if they make the wrong decision, then you can challenge it. And I believe that the European Court of Human Rights allows, or data protection authorities and other authorities in Europe allow for media to intervene to say that things should be kept up, right? So what Google, the first thing Google does when they try to take down a website on a certain name search result is they tell, say, the journalist whose website it is, hey, we might take this down. Then they can come in and advocate to keep it up. So I think at least there's an orderly process there. There is, by the way, a Cory Doctorow story called Scoogled. It's about the situation you're describing. And it imagines a future Google where it's like Google has ultimate power. It can take down all the most embarrassing stuff about people. If it likes you, it takes stuff down. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So I think having government involved is important. I think with regulation and capture, it's true, although there are modes of preventing regulatory capture. And I think one mode of preventing regulatory capture, I know it may not be a popular mode here, is the Singaporean model, where you pay public servants very high, very well, and you prevent them from going into industry, right? But I think one of the things that makes the US so troubling and problematic as an example is that you have so many people that go in for a couple years to government and then go to work for a bank or a big internet firm and then go back, etc. And there's actually a thing called the Google Transparency Project that shows the revolving door between all the people who were in Google and go to government and then go back and come back. You know, it's like a circle. That's very troubling. But luckily there are scholars that think about this full time. There's an incredible book called Preventing Regulatory Capture. And that book, I hope it gets very wide circulation and translated for many jurisdictions because it lays out all potential strategies that have been tried to insulate entities. My last word on that would be that I teach administrative law, and administrative law really can be thought of as the regulation of who watches the watchers, right? So our whole theory of regulation is that you need to have, at least as of 1947 in the US under the Administrative Procedure Act, you need to have courts watching what agencies do, so they are not arbitrary and capricious. And that's where the judiciary can be very important. And that topic, though, I mean, I have to admit, it is constantly in ferment. The most important doctrine of American administrative law, the Chevron doctrine, is now under attack by the current Supreme Court. I mean, so the current Supreme Court they've announced basically, we think this doctrine may need to be altered or to get rid of it. They just announced this yesterday or 2 days ago. And so that it is going to be a big struggle there. You know, I mean, the irony is that the court will probably wait until there's a Democratic president and then announce, oh, no deference to the president. You know, but and that's tough. That's tough. You know, that's politics. You have to deal with it. But I think that you're right to say that you always have to have some theory of that. The other example I give in the book, in Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, is that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the U.S. is self-funded. So it's funded by licenses. Same with parts of the Food and Drug Administration under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. It's funded in a way that prevents it from having pressure from legislators who are pressured by business. So that's another model that I think is a model of independence that helps there. But yeah, the problem is a pervasive one, no doubt. Yeah.
Can I invite also some of the people with technology or engineering backgrounds? Because I know there are a few in the audience. After hearing so much discussion, I have an engineering background, so I would imagine many people, especially in Taiwan, AI is such a hot topic that's promoted by Ministry of Science and Technology and also by Ministry of Education to promote this data literacy into all level of schools. So there has been a lot of projects, fundings for that. So I would imagine for people who are developing or actually developing the algorithms, what are the guidelines, or are there going to be more specific talks about in terms of what they do when they're writing the algorithm and also developing these tools? So I'm sorry, I don't know if you have a technology background, but I'm just encouraging also from the audience, from the floor to comment or ask questions. Sorry for interruptions. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pasquale. I think your speech is pretty informative, and I don't have engineering background, but I do have a relevant question about this. So I'm interested in the idea you mentioned in the end of your speech about the social hypergravity. So the basic idea is like this. So you think the multiple dimensions of humanity or social action could be compressed into fewer dimensions or something like this, right? So, but there is a counter-argument against, or not against, try to provide another perspective instead of your position that when individuals they are making some kind of decisions, they need to decrease the cost of deliberation. So if you think too many things, you can make a decision. For example, you are not familiar with Taiwan food style, right? And this is your second time visiting Taiwan. So what do you want to do, or what do you want to have for dinner today? You just open the Yelp and see the review. So this kind of review is a kind of evaluation compressed by multiple dimensions. So I think this is a kind of counter-argument, and if this counter-argument stands, then the question would be how to balance between the multiple dimensions and the fewer dimensions in terms of the scoring or moral profiling or some kind of these algorithms can achieve. So this is a question I want to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that question of dimensionality is a really interesting one to reflect on, right? Because I think my fundamental objection was to the concept that any human being can be valued as either a high score or a low score, right? As for all of their life, right? And you can imagine on a test or on a certain type of, even on creditworthiness maybe, you could be ranked from 200 to 800 or 1 to 100 or 1 to 10 or what have you. But one thing I was inspired by is an increasing literature on the tyranny of metrics. So there's a piece recently written by Jerry Muller called The Tyranny of Metrics, put out by Princeton Press. And it talks about the problems that arise when you try to commensurate all sorts of very different things on a single scale. And it certainly happens in a university context, to researchers who are drudged on citations or I-10 index or H-index or things like this. But you're right to say that they are forms of data that might be seen as, that could be seen as more objective or parsing a sphere. And I think one of the big challenges for the future is to consider where is that appropriate and where is it not. I think it is appropriate with restaurants because the stakes are pretty low, right? I mean, it's like if I go to a restaurant and, if it turns out that in my life, a restaurant has been misranked, and in fact, I could have had a life-changing meal at the best meal ever. If I just, if Yelp just was more conscientious about ranking things well, not a big deal, right? I mean, maybe, of course, maybe from an Epicurean perspective, it is a big deal, but I guess I'm enough of a ascetic to just discount it. But I think that to the extent that, someone were determining whether a person's value to society, or whether they get an organ or not, this is something that, comes up in allocation of organs in the US, of like a kidney or a lung transplant or something like that. There are other areas where I think the stakes are high enough that there are more considerations that need to be brought in. I'd also bring in something that I think is really an important angle, and it was something that it really changed my mind about the nature of when someone says something is data-driven. Okay? Because when we hear data-driven, our first impulse is to say, that must be a lot better than just some random person's opinion, right? But what data-driven also is that they found one set of data, and they're judging on the basis of that or some limited set of numbers, and everything else goes out the window, right? If you were to evaluate professors and just said, well, it's student evaluations and it's a number of citations or something like that, everything else goes out the window, you know? And that's one reason why I think letters of recommendation are important, because you want to have someone that knows you, that actually can describe, here are this person's unique qualities, here's something that is really special about them, etc. Right? And I think those sorts of narrative evaluations are important. It's also important for everybody who's outside of the fields of like mathematics, engineering, economics, computer science, to realize that their ways of describing the world are always at risk of being displaced by those other fields. Right? And so that balance is really key. So you brought it up, you said the balance is really important. So I agree. I think that that's going to be a major challenge, is finding what is the right balance between things that are more qualitative, subjective, written language, as opposed to things that are quantitative, algorithmic, and computational. And I think the guiding theme of what's guided me from this black box project to my current project, which is all about artificial intelligence and robotics, and I'm hopefully going to finish the next book in another year or so, is that there are distinct and uniquely valuable forms of human expertise that don't boil down to or reduce to one another, right? We can't do that.
Thank you, Professor. I want to ask about what you think about behavioral advertising in commercial areas. You specifically mentioned in your slides that in your 2018 position, you changed your mind. You want to ban all of the behavioral advertising in politics. But how about commercial areas? And I feel that what you just said, your response to the previous question, seems to me that you're suggesting that perhaps some types of advertising, targeted advertising, is okay because the stakes are so low, right? You're not going to have a life-changing meal. But I want to push back a little bit to think about more maybe higher level, more philosophically speaking, that these kinds of advertising, they're like other kinds of advertising, they're manipulative, they're secretive. They conceal themselves most of the time. And so they objectify human beings because they treat us like things. We feed data, like you just said, we do our emotional labor. So from that perspective, would you say you want to ban some kinds of advertising, targeted advertising, behavioral advertising in commercial areas, not just in politics?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think, I'll give some examples where I think it's the closest cases for either a ban or disclosure or both. One is that it was revealed a few years ago. Well, the lead academic article in the US is by Ryan Calo called Digital Market Manipulation. And he definitely goes through all these ways in which people can be overly manipulated by sellers. There's another piece by Rebecca Tushnet called Gone in 60 Milliseconds. It talks about how quickly the brain can be affected by certain images and how manipulative these images can be. I think very concretely about the example of a certain seller of cosmetics did research on when do people feel most insecure during the day, and then showed the ads, right? And said, do you really feel you're looking your best? And I think that's somewhat troubling, right? I think also the behavioral advertising with respect to direct-to-consumer drugs is quite a fraught area, and it's amazing to see how many ads are on U.S. channels for very powerful drugs. Say, ask your doctor for this antipsychotic or something. And it just strikes me as very strange, because the advertising is itself playing on the presumed mental incapacity of the person watching it. So I think that's another case that's troubling. I wonder, I mean, it's funny. I think like 10 years ago, I was much more anti-consumerist, you know? It's funny, sometimes nowadays I sort of feel like people need to be drawn into buying certain things sometimes, because it's just, you know, how's the economy going to keep going? I don't know. I think these macroeconomic considerations are important. But, I mean, I would love to hear more about if you thought that there was any sort of particular areas where it's particularly troubling. Oh, I will say, and here's another example that I think I've recently written about, is the US has this massive opioid addiction crisis. It's so massive that actually the life expectancy of many citizens in the US is going down in many regions. In some regions, life expectancy of white females has gone down 5 years in the past 10 years. And these are called like deaths of despair, because they're people that often live in areas where the jobs have gone away, they're despairing, they get hooked on, they do a difficult job, they get hooked on a painkiller, an opioid. And there are opioid addiction clinics that advertise to these folks, and they manipulate them into thinking that, you know, this is the best opioid addiction clinic, or they put fake testimonials online. And those are things that I think should be quite tightly regulated. What's also amazing about them is that Google, it's alleged, helps them find who has the best insurance. So Google, some insurance in the US will pay a lot of money, and some pays almost nothing. So Google can help target the ads to the person with the best health insurance, right? Which again is just horrible. You know, it's very troubling to think about how people are being herded in different directions. And the worst thing that comes out of this, or one of many bad things, is that bad clinics hijack user-generated content. So Google just said, well, we're going to ban advertising on this stuff because it seems like it's so shady. Well, then people go into the maps and they change the phone numbers of rival clinics and say, oh, that's not my phone number, it's a different phone number. So there's wrong numbers to every clinic except for the one that's the fraudulent clinic. Right? And this, I think, is really troubling because, you know, oh, and by the way, there's a parallel example with the Chinese social credit scoring where it's been reported that banks report to the government or to the entities that are doing the scoring about their best customers. They say they're the worst. So then all the other banks say, oh, that person, we shouldn't lend to them. So then their best customer is stuck with them, right? So these systems, and again, I think all of this is, these frauds and scams are rooted in a single evil, which is not employing people and paying people, right? Instead, you have a few people at the top of the company that have tens of billions of dollars, and you have all these jobs that aren't getting done. And that, to me, is my most fundamental like change in perspective on these big internet giants, is that so many of them, they aren't doing the work of making sure that what goes on the platform is legitimate and fair and not a fraud. So I think to come back to your original question, I think that regulating certain behavioral advertising is important. Stopping very manipulative ones are important. You also see that with respect to finance. So for example, one rule could be that, you know, you don't let people get on certain financial products if they can't pay them back. You know? But I think you're right to suggest that all of these different areas, rather than, my final answer would be, rather than trying to ban particular ads, I think the regulation of healthcare, regulation of finance, regulation of these other areas, they have to go in and make sure that the ads are legitimate and that those who are putting up bad ads get punished by the regulatory authorities, be they finance, health, other areas like that.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your wonderful speech today. I'm a student from National Charles University School of Law. So in your book, The Black Box Society, the main focus is on search, finance, social media, but I assume there must be a lot more areas in data and artificial intelligence where the black box concept still applies. For example, like as you mentioned today, autonomous vehicles. So I was wondering if you agree that in autonomous vehicles or other artificial intelligence industries, that the black box society has some negative effect on the development of these areas, in the sense that a lot of data and algorithms are hidden, and liability is very difficult to attribute, and which makes the public hesitant to use these services.
Yes, that's a great question. And I mean, in the new book, I'm looking at the algorithms and artificial intelligence in healthcare, education, the military, policing, and other areas, where it's sort of becoming very concrete and having very concrete effects on individuals' lives. I think the place where I'm most scared of it being deployed right now is in the military and policing, because I think that there are ways in which, you know, direct violence can be meted out against someone on the basis of an algorithmic determination that is, you know, not explainable. And that, I think, is quite troubling. In medicine, it's really fascinating because there's a tension among a lot of doctors between those who want to invest in forms of artificial intelligence that can be explained. So I met this one machine learning and medicine doctor, researcher, Josh Swamidas at Washington University last year. I think explainability is really important. And others who say, no, you know, if we're just talking about finding patches that might be cancer, and we have 30 million images of a cancerous mass and 20 million of a non-cancerous mass, we can have a computer compare and just make the judgment this is cancerous or non-cancerous. We don't need to understand why that's the case, right? So, one thing I've been working on with some of my students at Maryland is what informed consent to medical procedures looks like when neither the doctor nor the patient can understand why the diagnosis has been made, right? When they're just told it's been the machine that has looked at patterns and the machine is somehow more accurate than individuals. And my position is that people must be told that that's actually what's going on, just out of respect for them, not necessarily out of it having any particular impact on the treatment regimen or something like that. But I think it is appropriate. I mean, the area where I think it gets extremely difficult and very tough issues are raised are with psychotherapy. So we now are getting massive amounts of data about, from like crisis text lines, people who are suicidal that call in, or that text, and want to have texts, or even calls too. And we might eventually find that an automated response system is more accurate or is better able to keep people from committing suicide than a human respondent. And whether we, and if we knew that knowledge that it was a computer would subvert the healing effect, would we tell the person? And what's very interesting is in like in American medical law, you actually have a way out of that. Like if there are exceptions to informed consent, and one of the exceptions is if you think telling the person the actual nature of their problem or the procedure would ruin the possibility of it succeeding, you don't have to tell them, right? And so in that situation, you could imagine a future where there is a black box suicide hotline where an AI, not a person, is writing back messages to people. I think that's very creepy. I think it's very sad, but it highlights the difference, right? It highlights sort of our ethical values, because I think a society would be perfectly entitled to say, even if the AI text would be more effective, we want humans doing this job, and we want the assurance to everyone that humans will do the job. Another society may say, we are strict utilitarians, and whatever keeps people alive is what we want. And I really look forward to more debates over that, because I think the same thing would happen with, it's called, with drones, the disposition matrix. During the Bush administration, and under Obama too, they would be deciding who are the terrorists in Afghanistan or Pakistan we should just drop a bomb on, right? That Americans should just drop a bomb on. And it's quite possible to imagine a future where an AI or machine learning program would be better at deciding who to bomb than the humans who are presently in charge of that task. But I think it's also, it's quite legitimate for people to say, even if there would be less unmerited deaths, that part of what makes war legitimate is the personal responsibility of the individual for making the kill decision, the decision to kill. So, yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I've been thinking and trying to write about that for the past couple of years, and hopefully the book will be done soon. Thanks.
So I want to ask a question about the technology still, because, well, STS is, it's really interesting now people are talking about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, and there are a lot of things to it seems that there are a lot of borders. About 5 years ago, I was still described STS as an interdisciplinary disciplines. But there are talks among the STS community nowadays saying that, are there actually disciplines to be crossed? Can we not have the disciplines? Because a lot of talks here are really have to draw in and also invite more and more specialties and people, preferably people with different, multiple specialties to make these conversations really even meaningful, even deeper, and actually create the ability and energy to go forward to make some solutions. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the technology in terms of digitization and discretization, right? It's all become possible because we are quantifying and discretize many things and store them digitally. And I'm just wondering how, because if you go in and take a textbook from engineering or science, it's basically some of the underlying principle of that. You have to quantify things in order to process, understand it. And I'm just very concerned that when that gets happen very early in our learning life cycle, it's very hard to reverse that. If you go into engineering textbook, there's actually not many adjectives in them. Because it's not necessary, so I compare our quantities. And when it becomes that way, how in the, right now we're talking about big companies with talented people, and they're able to write thousands and millions of codes that nobody can understand. And how do you see if there's a way to tap into those big maze of technology? If you would pick some stars, where would that be? Because talking about law and finance, people probably are more interested about finance and law. But I found that is incredibly abstract, and it's very, we need a lot of bridgings and collaborations for this big goal. So I'd like to hear from you that, where are the stars?
Sure, I completely agree with you about that need for interdisciplinary thought and for a scholarship that bridges the boundaries between social science and law and other fields. And I think that, again, to bring it to the concrete examples, I have been watching the Facebook newsfeed and how it picks trending stories and how it deals with fake news for a while. And I think that what was problematic there is that you had a lot of folks who are very technically skilled, also very young. I think the median age of the company is like 23, 24, right? And it's amazing, it's great that they're geniuses that have all this energy and potential. But there needs to be also a recognition that there are other fields. And that sometimes a journalist that has 20 or 30 years of experience may be needed to explain news judgment, right? So if your news judgment is just how many people are clicking on something, make that the trending big story, right? That's not really judgment. That's a purely algorithmic determination. You can add many layers of dimensionality to that, right? You could say, how fast are they clicking on it? Do they put a happy face or a mad face, or something on it, etc. You can add all these things to it, but you're not exercising the judgment of a journalist. And one of the things that I really appreciate, there's a sociologist, Will Davies, that writes about the professions and that writes about, and he says that sometimes it seems as though machine learning and artificial intelligence wants to be the master profession. And if it becomes that, it becomes an epistemological tyranny. It's like a tyranny of ways of knowing the world. So I was really happy to see that Facebook brought in a lot of human beings to review for fake news or to review for other things like that, because I think it's just something that an algorithm either it can't do, and even if you think it could replicate what they're doing now, it's essential to have human beings governing certain processes, including our processes of knowing the world. In a way, like it or not, the press is the brain of society, right? And it's sort of like the way we as a society debate where we're going, what we're doing, is very much through the media, right? And I don't know, I mean, I don't think you can push this organic metaphor too far, but finance is the heart, in a way. You know, what gets money, what doesn't? It's fundamental to what a society is and what it does. And we need governance of those areas. I think that the most important thing is to try to assure, one of the things I've been pushing for in the United States is to get a council of, we have a council of economic advisors for the president. We need a council of sociological advisors, historical advisors, anthropological advisors, other advisors, you know, even literary advisors. I mean, you know, there's lots you can learn from all of these different fields that you can actually have a sensibility cultivated. I'm not saying, you know, put them in charge of the Fed right now, you know. But what's interesting about the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US, is that in the 1950s, it was half lawyers and half economists. And the story of that bank, is the story of quantitatively gifted people systematically pushing out people with legal expertise. People who may have been quite useful, I think, in many areas, right? And admittedly, I'm a lawyer, so I guess I'm pleading self-interest. But I think it's really interesting to look at, you know, how different policy can be if you have different forms of expertise involved. And to make that expertise more plural is important. So I think you're absolutely right to say that that's incredibly important to bring in different perspectives. And I'm part of a group now that does something called modern monetary theory. It's trying to bring back some of the sensibility of the central bank from the 40s and 50s to believe in a broader role for the state in deciding and encouraging productive enterprise. So, thanks.
So that we last question for today.
I just try to make a little comment when you are asking the lady. Actually, designing privacy in Europe is started almost, I think it's 12 or 15 years ago already. So that is much earlier than the GDPR is began. So actually in Europe, right now you go to the engineering school, they'll tell you what is design in privacy. You know, but unfortunately in Taiwan, very little people understand that. Okay. Second of all, I'd like to say that in the internet, basically the standard came from the IETF RFC. In the past, RFC, just like you say, is a very engineered. But I think it just right about 4 or 5 years ago, that IETF began to watch about the privacy issues. So, and security issue, you know, because sometimes privacy and the security go together. You know. Particularly if you watch carefully, the new IETF chairwoman called Alexa Cooper, her PhD, Dr. Assessors, is writing about the online privacy. She's an engineer. And so I think there is a problem is in Taiwan, or maybe other countries, the engineering school doesn't really give the engineer. You know, you have to be careful about the privacy or data protection issue because that's a part of our life. You know, engineer it's not just input and algorithm and output. In between those of what Frank says is a black box. The black box should be somewhere you can overlook and to make sure your design coming out. In the past, I think in the Taiwan, most of the engineer, the algorithm design, the company will hire the lawyer to check you have a patent violation or
intellectual property, but we don't really, are you fit with the GDP or not? Or you're not going to sell any product to Europe, you know? So I think this is something we have to do, you know? And I just like to mention to you is that even in the engineering world community, it's changing now, you know, it's changing now. And of course, we know I can have a difficulty with the GDP now, you know, but whatever, this is a coming trend, you know, in the engineering school, the people have to think about when you put into the design or when you put into the algorithm, you have to put something in there, you know, the legal, not just the patent and intellectual property. It's much more than that.
I would just say I completely I just wanted to completely agree with you that I think that it's important. Luckily, I was part of a group called the Council on Big Data Ethics and Society in the US, and we have put out a publication called 10 Simple Rules for Responsible Big Data Research. That's the beginning of a much larger curriculum of bringing ethics to engineering schools. And there's actually, if anyone's interested, I can send you a spreadsheet of 170 ethics and computer science courses that are taught in the US. So luckily there's a big effort to aggregate all this information now. So thank you.
Okay, thank you audience for such a wonderful Q&A session and lots of comments and thoughts. And following our last discussion of bringing all and more disciplines, well, or specialties together, I want to announce an invitation from the Humanity and Social Science Center, who is the organizer of this event. So they are sponsoring a discussion group in Tsinghua University, and it's a part of a project for developing Humanity and Social Science AI research training program. And it aims for collecting the ideas from humanity and social science community, and also to identify the need for further research exchanges. So they have set a date, which is July 17th in Tsinghua University. The organizer in Tsinghua is Professor Lin Wenyuan. So if you are interested, I think it's perfectly fine to be bilingual. So if you are interested, please look out for further announcement made by the Humanity HSS, Humanity and Social Science Center of the Ministry of Social Science and Technology. And actually, as a host, I want to make comments about the topic for today. It's in Chinese and it's not in English. It's Professor Pasquale's note of reminding us to come back to the people. Because in the Chinese title of today, there's a term, civil society. It's not in the English title. So it is very important, I think, today we learn that for all these technological development and also development in the complex code of finance and legal system, and there's something that should always be there is the people. And often that we got too good and then we got carried away. And for a lot of scholars in the academia today in Taiwan, I'm sure most of you will probably feel the same as I am feeling now, that it's shifting. We're shifting from SCI numbers to social contribution index. I hope. And I think the precious thing about Taiwan, which personally I think a lot of our folks should be very proud of, is we are such a vibrant society. Things change very quickly. And so we hope that we can change for the good and good direction. And we will all work together. For many, for global society, that Taiwan is often referred to as the high-tech island. So I've been thinking, how do we get this high-tech a good ranking? Not just how much semiconductor, how much consumer products they would produce every year, but actually to take all our intelligence and to work together to develop good for people, the really valuable use of technology and everything around it. So please, let's thank Professor Pasquale again for this inspiring talk, and we have further work to do. Thank you, audience, and have a nice